Thank you all for coming. So I've bitten off way more than I can chew. I'm going to make sure I know how to advance this. Is it just, that does it, okay. So I've bitten off way more than I can chew in 20 minutes, but I've chosen to talk about Catholic social teaching and land value taxation because our current practices and patterns of real estate development are so obviously failing. We have a housing crisis of epic proportions that includes both widespread unaffordability and widespread homelessness, and too much of the product our building culture produces is neither well built nor especially convenient nor especially lovable. The middle class is shrinking and the gap between rich and poor grows ever wider, with predictable political tensions and deaths of despair both rising. To add to the dismay, the large bills for the economic and environmental costs of the way we build today are coming due. For these reasons and in these historic circumstances, a steadily growing number of policy wonks and public officials, many of them millennials, not coincidentally, are talking more seriously about a form of taxation first proposed in the late 19th century by the American political economist Henry George, a tax on the unimproved value of land as a primary source of public revenues. This tax would replace at least some other taxes. Most notably, it would replace the tax on buildings, characteristic of our current property tax system, which would have the beneficial effects of incentivizing the construction of new buildings and the care and maintenance of old ones, and disincentivizing the practice of land banking of vacant and derelict properties for purposes of land speculation. The two best known popular maxims of real estate investment are buy land because they're not making any more of it, and location, location, location. And though these be truths, their ripples are not benign in their effects given our public policy regime. So my proposition this morning is that in light of Catholic social teaching, land value taxation as a general principle, details of which would, as always, be worked out locally, is an idea that should be embraced by the Catholic Church, Catholic ancillary institutions, Catholic architects, Catholic developers, and eventually, I hope, by all people of goodwill. It is surely too much to embrace it as the panacea of unjust wealth inequality, but it is not too much to understand it as a helpful and perhaps necessary tool toward improving our general culture of building and promoting a more just society that better supports the common good by more widely promoting human flourishing. So I want to start out with just a quick review of Catholic social teaching and the market economy. This kind of summarizes an essay written by Robert Barron. He's actually written a lot about Catholic social teaching and the market economy. But in this particular essay, he summarizes and reiterates themes from Rerum Novarum by Leo XIII in 1891 and Centesimus Annus by John Paul II in 1991. In it, he highlights the Catholic social teaching defense of the market economy, of private property, of entrepreneurship, and of profits. But he notes three importantly qualifying Catholic social teaching words of warning against unbridled capitalism, against laissez-faire capitalism. So the constraints that follow from, the first of these are the constraints that follow from insistent Catholic regard for the common good. Second is the acknowledgement of the necessity of legal regulations and occasional state interventions in the economy. And Bishop Barron uses the analogy of the state as a referee for the common good at various levels, as stepping in to make sure that the public games are being played in a manner that is good for the game itself and that doesn't let the ends of the game get out of hand. And the game here is the idea of the common good. And so the state, the church recognizes the duties of the state to step in and level, keep the playing field level. And then the third thing is the acknowledgement that a humane market economy can only exist within a larger culture of life. And I take this to mean that the market economy appeals to our desires, and not all of our desires are necessarily benign. And so it really, the humane market economy, it can go off the rails if it doesn't exist within this larger context and setting of a culture of life. Now, Leo's 1891 Rerum Novarum is really the fountainhead of modern Catholic social teaching, and it subsequently became the basis for church labor activism in the 20th century, for the Catholic worker movement, and also was inspirational for the G.K. Chesterton Hilary Belloc economic theory that's known as distributism, which argues essentially for private property widely distributed, a localist economy, and decentralized forms of political power. And it's interesting that distributism has always been criticized, both within and from outside Catholic circles, for lacking a kind of plausible economic revenue foundation. And I think that one of the interesting things about land value taxation is that it's quite consonant with ideas of distributism, and could be one of the foundational one of the foundation pieces of a distributist economy. Now I'm going to show, I'm going to just make a quick distinction in a very simplistic way between a property tax and a land value tax. This just sort of gives you the idea of what it is. It doesn't really explain the sort of larger implications. But this would be an example of a revenue neutral land value tax applied to a condition where typical property tax. So in this diagram, you've got 4 parcels on a block. They're all the same size. They're all valued. The land, so they're property taxes collect tax on land and buildings. I'm sure most of you know this, but it collects tax on land and buildings. A land value tax would simply collect tax on the unimproved value of land. So that means it wouldn't tax any buildings. It doesn't tax improvements, doesn't tax new buildings. And so what you have on the left, on that block, they're collecting $10,000. The total assessed value of the block is $1 million, $400,000 in land, $600,000 in buildings, and they collect $10,000 at a 1% tax rate. So the vacant lot pays the 2 vacant lots pay $100,000. I'm sorry, they pay $1,000 in property tax, but just for the value of their land. And the building owners pay $4,000 in property tax for their land and their building. So under a land value tax, where you were going to do a revenue neutral tax, you'd be collecting the same amount of tax money, but you wouldn't be taxing the buildings. And so if the land value for each of those, the unimproved land value is $100,000, then you'll collect $2,500 from each landowner, but not tax the buildings at all, which seems like a very simple sort of thing, but it has really interesting implications with respect to incentivizing how property is used and developed, right? Because by changing to a land value tax, you do 2 things. You incentivize builders, right? You incentivize the productive use of land, because you are not paying any extra tax for making improvements on your property, whether it's a new building or whether it's an addition or a renovation of an existing building. And you're also disincentivizing land speculation, land banking, because now the person who's just been sitting on vacant land cheaply and waiting for other people to do work that will increase the value of the property is having to pay what you would call a fair share of taxes if you're looking at this in terms of land. So I want to go back to the issue of Catholic social teaching. And I want to talk about private property and land, and the notion of whether land, the church defends private property. There's a question about whether or not land is properly considered private property. And it's interesting that in Rerum Novarum and also in Centesimus Annus and also in Robert Barron's summary, they all approve of John Locke's theory of land and of private property. And in the second treatise, boy, this went haywire, but let's see if I can read it. In the second treatise, Locke writes that in the state of nature, writes Locke, nobody has originally a private dominion exclusive of the rest of mankind. Yet, by a, well, basically the theory is that when labor is applied to land, the labor is fused with the land and the land becomes property. And that is how land is considered private property. And what's interesting is that Leo XIII agrees with that, John Paul agrees with it, Robert Barron agrees with it, but it doesn't really fit with, certainly doesn't fit with the vision of land in the Old Testament, where the land is owned by God and is used by the Israelites, and it doesn't really fit a lot of the teachings of the church fathers about what land is, and Henry George has a different assessment of that. So Locke's thesis is challenged by George, where he writes about and this is in the context of when Leo when Leo issued Rerum Novarum, it was understood correctly as being an argument against socialism. Now, socialism wasn't defined very well, but it was clear it was an argument against socialism. And Henry George thought, and for reasons that make a little bit of sense, but they're complicated, he thought that he was being targeted, that his theories were being targeted in Rerum Novarum, and so he wrote a book-length open letter to Leo XIII, the year that Rerum Novarum was published. And it's extremely interesting. It's very respectful. It's very sympathetic to the objectives of Rerum Novarum, but he criticizes Leo for having the wrong view of land. And so this is where some of these ideas. And also that he was really fighting back against the charge that he was a socialist. And you'll see why some people might have thought he was a socialist, because of what his view of land is. But other than that, he was very much a free market kind of guy. And so he begins by talking about, the legitimacy of private property. It says, being created individuals with individual wants and powers, men are individually entitled, subject, of course, to the moral obligations that arise from such relations as that of the family, to the use of their own powers and the enjoyment of the results. There thus arises, anterior to human law, and deriving its validity from the law of God, a right of private ownership in things produced by labor, a right that the possessor may transfer, but of which to deprive him without his will is theft. This right of property, originating in the right of the individual to himself, is the only full and complete right of property. It attaches to things produced by labor, but cannot attach to things created by God, namely land. And I'm going to talk about what he means by land in just a minute, but really what he means by land is land is a synecdoche for all nature, for all everything that is found there that was not created by human beings, right? So it's created by God. So he goes on, he says, thus if a man takes a fish, and the implication of that is that human beings can't own it because we didn't make it. So thus if a man takes a fish from the ocean, he acquires a right of property in that fish, which exclusive right he may transfer by sale or gift, but he cannot obtain a similar right of property in the ocean itself, so that he may sell it or give it or forbid others to use it. And he makes the same analogy with respect to wind power. So I'm going to pursue this in a minute. But Locke's thesis, I want to suggest about fusion, right, and about how land becomes private property, is also challenged, I think, implicitly in Laudato Si. And there's a passage in Laudato Si in paragraph 30 where Francis is writing about access to safe drinkable water is a basic and universal human right, since it is essential to human survival and as such is a condition for the exercise of other human rights. Well, the thing is, that's even more true of land. I mean, so you take the inference, you draw the inference from what he's saying about water, and you can apply it to so many other things that it's impossible for human beings, to flourish without access to land. And again, understanding land is more than just dirt. Understanding land as all natural resources. And again, there's this precedent in Scripture and in the fathers of the church about what it means to use land as opposed to owning land. That only God owns land. So I want to define some key terms here of George. And so his big book is Progress and Poverty. It's about this thick. It's kind of like reading an economic treatise written by Charles Dickens with, let's see, more analogies than anyone but G.K. Chesterton. It's not a bad read, actually, for an economic treatise. But he's very careful. It's as long as it is, because he's defining terms very carefully. And so in a way, the critical triad is talking about the factors of production. The factors of production are three. They are labor, capital, and land. And what's interesting is that this is in keeping with the classic liberal theories of Adam Smith and David Ricardo and John Stuart Mill. But in the 20th century, in neoliberal economic theory, land has been lost. Land is folded in and has become part of capital. But land behaves very different than capital. And so George's definitions of some of these terms are not as, they're not entirely orthodox, but he gives very good reasons for why he's defined them as the way they are. And they're actually, I think, more subtle. So that labor itself, just to take some of the big ones, labor itself is all human exertion, including making, moving, and exchanging, typically toward an end, most often toward wealth. And importantly, there's no quantitative limit to labor. Wealth itself is nature's bounty, touched by human labor, resulting in a tangible product that is an object of human desire. He gives a good account of exchange value that is actually closer to what we have today. It talks about production itself as labor applied toward the end of making wealth. And then wages are important because wages are that part of wealth which is the return to labor, right? So when you work and you get, you're directly paid in wages, and it doesn't necessarily, it comes in a variety of forms. It's whatever is received as a result of human exertion, whether it's from an employer, from customers, or from nature, whether it's by barter, that's what constitutes wages. And wages and labor are the foundation of capital. This is one of the places where George takes exception to the other prevailing economic theories that argue that capital is necessary for the creation of labor. He says, no, capital is always secondary to labor, and that capital he defines as wealth that is used to produce more wealth, or wealth in the course of exchange. And as in labor, there's no quantitative limit to capital. But what he means by, what's an example of capital? It would be buying a tool. It would be making a building to house the productive activity. That it's the use of wealth to make more wealth. But again, it's always a secondary thing. There's a lot of confusion about this. All capital is wealth, but not all wealth is capital. An owner's intention transforms wealth for enjoyment into capital when it's done for use. And then this is a really critical point, that both labor and land are excluded from, that is, they are not capital. But in neoliberal economics, land has simply been folded into capital. And then interest is that part of wealth which is the return for the use of capital. And then we come to land. Land is the entire material universe exclusive of people and what people produce, not wealth, not capital, rather the source and generator of all wealth. Land exists before anything humans can make and is itself something that no human being can make and therefore cannot own. And unlike labor and unlike capital, there cannot be an increase in the quantity of land. And again, this is not making any more of it. Rental value determined by location. These are all kind of real estate maxims. Now, and then the critical term is rent. Rent is that part of wealth which is the return for the use of land. And this is kind of the critical point about what is the distorting feature of the economy, that it's less capital. George doesn't see capital and labor as being in opposition to each other, but rather What distorts the economy, what creates wealth inequality is rent, because rent is something, there's a law of rent. It's particularly in the matter of housing, because of the relationship of housing to land. In a hot market, housing does not act according to laws, regular commodities laws of supply and demand. You can increase the supply of housing, but as we can see everywhere in every hot market, that when you do that, it can't keep pace with the increase in rent. And I don't have time to kind of explain the law, Ricardo's law of rent, but it seems to fit. And so it's one of those issues that's very insightful. I'm at the end of the time. I'll take a question if I have time for a question, but again, it was way too much material for me to try to cover in 20 minutes. So thank you very much for. I have 20 other slides.
Yeah.